Passover, the Jewish festival in Jerusalem, as hundreds of people came to the city from the surrounding countryside. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, came to town. They typically lived elsewhere. They didn't live in these county seats, these capitals surrounding in their territories that they were in. But it was not a show of support for the local practices and rituals of the people. It was a very intentional show of strength and power. A reminder. The governor, the entire court of Roman officials, the army battalion of that region of the Roman Empire, they would march into Jerusalem to send a message to the people that had come in for the celebration of the Passover. We allow this. Your traditions are by permission. You only get to do this because we let you do this, but we are still in charge. The power here is ours. The control here is ours. And they'd make a show of it. So on the first day of this Passover, Pontius Pilate comes in from the east, from the west, from the coastline into Jerusalem. Soldiers would be in full armor, not going to war, but in a parade. Not in their dress blues or dress whites, but the thick leather vests and skirts and those bronze swords at their side, and always the red plume that we know so well. Bannermen and trumpeters would be in front and behind of Pontius Pilate on a chariot of gold and bronze in purple royal robes, pulled by blinding white Arabians, horses. It was force. It was a threat. It was, we are bigger. We are stronger, we are richer, we are Rome, we are the empire. It displayed the might of Rome politically and with their military, also reinforced the theocracy of the Roman Empire. From the days of Alexander the Great, whoever was in charge of the Roman Empire was the Son of God, the son of Mars, and a human woman. Mars is, Romans stole Mars from the Greeks, and in the Greeks it was Ares, right? And then the Roman Empire took over. But whoever had Caesar in front of their name at that time was considered the son of Ares, the son of Mars. And Jerusalem was the center of the world. Rome was abstract to these people. Rome was a concept. They were living in the Roman Empire, right? But for 99% of these people, Rome was in their minds. Jerusalem was the city. I don't know, we're all aware of New York City, and some of us have even been there. But for the most part, we have a conceptual understanding of New York City, right? Jerusalem was the center of life. It was the center of their faith, their nation, their ethnicity. Also, it was brand new. Jerusalem had been destroyed in the first century before Jesus showed up. It had just been rebuilt. It was modern. It was state of the art. And it had just been fixed up. We remember Herod the Great from the Christmas story. He's long gone by the time Jesus was an adult. But Herod the Great had just had everything redone and repainted. All of the whites were blinding white, and all of the golds were shining gold. The temple in Jerusalem was this shining beacon for the community. Herod the Great died around Jesus' birth, and they split it between his 3 sons. But the Romans fired one of them in the year 6. That's it. Just 6. Just the year 6. That's the whole thing. And Herod Archelaus was moved out, and Pontius Pilate was moved in. Jerusalem was a sparkling place. It was a bustling place. And it was the center of the world. And in place here was an empirical system of domination and colonization. This system of domination by the Roman Empire depended on political oppression, by an oligarchy of wealthy elites and nobility. It depended upon the economic exploitation written into laws about land ownership of Hebrew people, taxation of Hebrew people, of the indenture of labor through debt of the Hebrew people, and the religious legitimation. The chief priests participated in this. High priest Caiaphas, in Jesus' day, high priest Caiaphas was the priest in charge of the Jerusalem temple, and he instituted the age-old policy of go along to get along, which many of the normal folks gave tacit approval to the empire. And of course, Caiaphas was profiting from his collusion, as was Pilate, as was Herod Antipas in the north. Into this tinderbox situation, the full physical and symbolic power of the Roman Empire marched, and the grand marshal of his parade was Pontius Pilate. And now I want you to imagine, on the other side of town, a different kind of processional was happening. A people's march. Instead of armored soldiers in formation, peasants danced down the street. Instead of fanfares of bronze horns, shouts of Hosanna, an old Hebrew honorific. Instead of banners emblazoned with the mark of Caesar's, branches that were just cut down because they were there. The only reason this is Palm Sunday is because they were walking into Jerusalem and they needed something to wave, and palm trees were right there. So they cut them down. They cut them off, and they waved those. And Pilate would have, his slaves would have handed out flower petals and rose petals to the crowd on his side of town. So they had things to throw in front of Pilate, right? This really disingenuous. The servants would go first and make sure everybody had rose petals for when Pilate showed up. These folks put their own coats on the ground. They didn't have any flower petals. And instead of the representative of Caesar, we can imagine him. We know what he looked like in this moment. He's draped in purple. He had that laurel on his head, that Roman Empire leaf laurel over his head. He's in this chariot being pulled by these brilliant white horses. And on the other side of town is a young Jewish man in a servant's robe, a peasant's robe, same clothes that everybody else had on the back of a donkey's foal that had never been ridden. How many of you have been on a horse or a mule or a donkey that has never been ridden before? So I want you to imagine these knobby-kneed, donkey babies who are just trying to figure out how to walk. So Jesus is marching in on this triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and his donkey and his legs are shaking, and he's too skinny, and he's too small, and he's taking really careful steps. I don't want us to misunderstand. Jesus set up Palm Sunday. Jesus knew exactly what he was doing every step of the way. What we know as Palm Sunday, what we read in the story as Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, this was an intentional and organized political demonstration against the empire of Rome and those who would collude with it and profit from it. If the Palm Sunday processional happened today in Kansas City, Missouri, my family and I would not go because we would be afraid somebody would drive their truck into it. But most of us, like the high priest Caiaphas, would be saying, just calm, guys. There are better ways to do this. Bring Rome to the table, right? Sit down and have a conversation with Pilate. You're going to get us in trouble. Don't rock this boat. Everything's fine. If you keep making noise, if you keep this up, we'll get Rome's attention, and we don't want Rome's attention. Except, while I'm saying this, I'm getting rich from Rome's attention. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem that we know as the triumphal entry that is both spiritual and theological and end times, and also a little smartass by calling it triumphal entry, right? We're good at that. This is intentional political theater. This is a protest and a coronation at the same time. The empire is sending their message: soldiers and force and violence and strength and wealth. Jesus is sending his message. You will never have their hearts. You will never have their joy. Because you don't feed that. And really, without hearts and without joy, do you actually have any power over them in the first place? This is an act of resistance that Jesus chose. And Palm Sunday leads directly into Good Friday, sets him up against Pilate and against Caiaphas, loudly. Jesus chose this. There's a lot of complicated theology in the sentence, Jesus chose this. But we're gonna push through that. Behind all of that stuff, it comes down to the same thing. Jesus put himself in direct conflict with the Roman Empire and the complacent and or complicit religious authorities. He confronted the political power of Pilate by subverting it. He exposed and disrupted the corruption and economic exploitation of the temple system, the temple sacrifice system. The next day, after Palm Sunday, he goes to the temple and turns over the tables of people who are selling doves for sacrifice in the temple, but charging interest. They're taking advantage of conversion rates between different coins of the region. And the people shouting, "Hosanna in the highest," this is basically long live the king. Jesus was causing trouble, and he knew it, and he chose it. Now, we call Jesus' choice, for lack of a better word, we call this kenosis. It's what we read today in Paul's Christ hymn. Paul describes poetically in the passage that we heard from Philippians this V-shaped action of Jesus. He slips out of exhortation and into a poetic style. And he shares that Jesus had the form of God, but considered equality with God not something to be pursued, gave that up to take on the form of humanity. In particular, Jesus became a peasant, a servant of God in humility and obedience, and finally an obedience that led to execution. And after that execution is the low of the V, right? And through that act of humility, Jesus was exalted, not just back to the form of God, but even higher, to the point where the world would know the reign of Christ as Lord, and every knee would bow and every tongue confess. We call this kenosis, which comes from the Greek word for emptying. The self-emptying of Jesus Christ. Charles Wesley, the hymn-writing little brother of the founder of our denomination, said, emptied himself of all but love. And Jesus poured himself out for the hearts and the joy and the hope of his community and those around him. Paul's hymn is a beautiful description of this action. That God, that Jesus, wherever your theology is, that this was a choice to slum it here with us. Even to the point of death on the cross. So, now, if I pulled that out of Philippians, and I'm sure you've experienced this, you've heard this sermon before, if I pulled that out of the entire Philippians letter and pulled it out of the context of the early Christian church and how they heard it and how Paul was using it, I could turn this into a pretty powerful gospel of guilt sermon, right? Look at what Jesus did for you. I could make us feel absolutely miserable about ourselves. Look at what Jesus gave up, all of this just for you. Look at what Jesus gave up, what Jesus sacrificed for you. And you won't even come to church if the Chiefs play at noon. Right? I could preach that sermon. And many people do. That turn of guilt and shame, people shaming people into responding to Jesus, like reciprocally. Look what Jesus did for you. This is what you should do for Jesus. It's like we've decided that one of the most powerful things that we can do to get people into the Christian faith is to make them feel as bad about themselves as we possibly can. But that is not how Paul uses this hymn. What did this passage start with? Let the same mind be in you that was in Jesus, who did all these things. This self-emptying of Christ is not something to shame us into belief. It's Paul saying, go and do this. Live like this. Model this kind of life. Jesus emptied himself of infinity, placed himself squarely in the path of the domination systems of this world, exploitation and oppression and violence, defeated them by inverting them, subverting them. Paul isn't saying, look what Jesus did for you. Paul is saying, go and do likewise. Have the same mind, have the same kind of mind that would make that decision. A mind that has access to all divine power and chose a peasant's protest and praise processional, who could have entered Jerusalem riding a golden unicorn Pegasus with the armies of heaven at his beck and call, but chose a knobby-kneed donkey's baby. Is there anything in this world for which you would give that up? Is there anything in this world for which you would give up everything? When Jesus says, love one another as I love you, this is what he means. To the loss of everything else. The good news of God's grace in Jesus Christ and for Palm Sunday arrives in the intentional, purposeful self-emptying, the humility of Jesus, the joy of the people, the confrontation of empire. The Christian challenge of Palm Sunday is presented by the example of Jesus, the kind of mind that would give up the power of God to undercut the power of oppression and injustice. The question for us on Palm Sunday, the question that Paul asks the people in Philippi is, will you give all of yourself for each other? Not out of guilt, not out of shame because look at what Jesus did for us. I like to say Jesus didn't just make a sacrifice, Jesus was the sacrifice. When he told us to love one another in the same way that he loved us, this is what he means, all the way, to the cost of everything, to the cross and back. Let the same mind be in you that was in Jesus Christ. Go and do likewise. Amen. We're going to worship God with the presentations of our tithes and our offerings in this moment and reflect on our teaching this morning. Everything we want to do as a church for our neighborhood comes out of these baskets. And